Me in. Yesterday you may have heard the Forest Service swore in a permanent chief. So Vicki Christensen is now chief of the Forest Service. Glad to have her. She comes from a state forestry background as well, and has been with the Forest Service for probably 8 years. But she brings a lot of what Secretary Perdue would consider the right kind of perspective in this customer service that you've already heard about. The Secretary is about doing business different, that's for sure. And he's kind of about getting on with it and getting it done sooner than later. So we're, with the Forest Service, we're not going to walk before we run. We're going to fly before we run or walk. So we're off to the races, and we may not have a lot of time, but we want to start seeing things done differently, and connecting with the constituents, the customers, is very much at the heart of that. A little bit about, before I get into something called shared stewardship, a little bit about Congress and their expectations. Forest Service has suffered for a long time with the way money is handled for suppressing wildfires. And this year, the Forest Service spent $2.6 billion on suppression. And that was $720 million more than they had. So that gets transferred out of other accounts to cover it until Congress decides whether they want to put it back or not. So that's a bit of a problem in the way the agency operates. It's disruptive, it interrupts flow, it doesn't help with budget formulation very much. So Congress decided to address that, and they did. So in 2020 that kicks in, and things will be handled a little bit differently. But along with that, Congress has some expectations, and their main expectation is that we start dealing with this issue before fire occurs, that we do more of the kind of management, the wildfire hazard reduction that's necessary to protect places. So they gave us some additional authorities. There's a whole lot more on the table that perhaps the Farm Bill will address, perhaps not, but and some in Congress think that they've given us enough authorities, so go out and show how they can be used before you ask for any more. Either way, more authorities, demonstrate first. The key decision makers in Congress that deal with this want to help. So we're about finding out how they can best do that. So the shared stewardship approach. It came on a little too fast. There's been plenty of people that have come in my office saying, where's the shared and shared stewardship? So we have to catch up with that, and we will. But the notion is that the Forest Service is going to sit down through governor's offices, however they want to handle it, and start comparing priorities. Congress has this expectation that there's 80 million acres of National Forest System lands that need to be treated because of wildfire risk. That'll never happen. Wildfire might treat them, but we're not going to get to them. So we have to decide what are we going to get to and where are we going to get to it. And Forest Service has the analytics to determine where wildfire is a problem, where we can do some active management, where we have access and environmental clearance to get after it right away. We can tell where wildfire is transmitted from national forests to communities and where that's the highest risk. And do that trade-off analysis for a lot of different things. I've talked about active management and forest management and wildfire, but if we wanted to have that same analysis tell us what it looks like for water or for recreation or for any of the other issues that might be there, we have the base and the system that'll help us with that. All that is the beginning of a discussion, though. The Forest Service would propose bringing that to the table. However a governor determines, we bring that to a table, and with whoever a governor determines, we bring that to the table and have a discussion. Here's how we see it. Here's some priorities that we think might be important for investment. What do you think? And where are your priorities? And they may be based on this kind of analysis. They may not. They may be based on their own analysis. They may be based purely on politics. Doesn't matter. We want to have that discussion about where we make those investments. And we want to do that together and as much as possible have mutual priorities. And those mutual priorities then look at a larger scale. They cross the boundaries. They produce something that accomplishes enough active management that it makes a difference. So we may not protect everything, but we want to, when we do make an investment, we want it to work. And not just for how the Forest Service sees it. Another piece of this is something called the Good Neighbor Agreement, because when I have this discussion with the regional foresters, and I've had it a couple of times lately, and they're still processing. What have I put them into? And they'll figure it out, and they are, and they've had a session with the secretary, so they know how he feels about it. Pretty strong. Wants to get on with it as soon as we can. We've got a number of Western governors ready to go right now. Let's sit down and do this. And one of the issues that keeps coming up is capacity, and the skill capacity in particular, that we may pick investments in places that we don't have the right set of skills. Well, we can adjust some to that, but instead of adjusting, I'm going to ask Bill to take care of it. This Good Neighbor Agreement business is important to us, that when we're in this with the states, we want to share the kinds of resources that might help make a difference as well. And so the state foresters become an important key in all of this. And in the next panel, you can ask Mary Farnsworth to explain Good Neighbor Agreement to you. She's pretty good at it. So things we're cautious about in this. Many states are in the throes of revising their forest action plan. We don't want to predetermine any outcomes from that because it has a lot of stakeholder input that's important to the state. So that has to be taken into account. Forest plans are there, and some are in revision and some aren't. And of course, those have something to do with all of this. And the collaborative processes that you've talked about, they take different forms in different places, but they're pretty key in how we get business done these days. And we don't want to interfere with that kind of decision process. But one way or another, we want to share the decision space and come up with mutual priorities on how we make our investments to produce some different kinds of outcomes at a larger scale. And that's what we're all about. If we only have 2 years to do it, we better get on with it. But it's about changing the way we do business as much as it is about what business we do. So that's where we are. I'll pass it on to Bill, and he can tell you the rest of the story.
Thanks, Jim. I need to start my talk off this morning with a mea culpa. The last time I realized driving in today that the last time I shared the podium with then Deputy Chief Jim Hubbard in this hotel, I recited a cowboy poem to him comparing him to a pile of horse manure. Who'da thunk? So that gives you a little bit about my strategic thought process. We're here to talk about restoration challenges in fire-affected landscapes. As we all know, we've developed a fairly complex and efficient system for responding to wildfires across the nation. For the most part, local, state, federal agencies work in a coordinated effort to protect life and property during a fire. At all levels, we have agreements, budgets, and manpower for prevention and suppression of wildfire. Nationally, we have a 98% success rate in dealing with fires and keeping them small. We train together, have common qualifications, have systems in place to assist each other during the response and suppression of wildfire. Afterwards, not so much. The land of the West is owned and managed by a complex array of players, private, state, multiple federal agencies. This leads to difficulties not only during fire suppression, but in aligning management responses, goals, and resources in carrying out forest management and restoration activities. Piled on top of these often conflicting management goals is a continued increase in development and infrastructure in interface areas. All of this, coupled with increased severity and occurrence of wildfire, has made restoration of wildfire an increasingly difficult issue. Let me clarify that in my discussion of restoration, I'm addressing natural restoration, not rebuilding infrastructure or buildings, but actual fire restoration. In most Western states, local and state government have little or no money available for fire past the actual suppression on private or state lands. Some dollars are available for post-fire restorations through EPA through the 319 grants, NRCS with EQIP and EWP, FEMA if it's a FMAG fire, there is some mitigation funds available post-fire, and the Forest Service through WUI landscape scale restoration or hazardous fuels grants, but those are always longer term after the fire. They're not immediate funds available. Securing these very limited funds for post-fire restoration, coming from multiple programs and agencies, each with their own set of requirements and authorities, is challenging indeed. Should have folded my pages better before I did this, Jim. Depending on industry to pay for salvaged timber to fund restoration is not always a solution. High-intensity wildfires can lead to destruction of timber, as well as a decrease in the area's regrowth and regeneration potential. They can serve as a major disincentive for wood processors to locate facilities in beetle-kill fire-prone areas. Thus, the problem itself blocks the solution tool needed to restore our forest. If we look at the ecological impacts of wildfire or pre-wildfire, the increased insect populations resulted in longer summers, milder winters has led to severe outbreaks of tree-feeding insects, which in turn resulted in 1 million acres of standing timber. Higher levels of tree mortality due to insect epidemics has added significant amounts of woody fuels, which has contributed to increased risk of catastrophic high-intensity wildfires. High-intensity, high-heat wildfires are capable of chemically altering forest soils and destroying valuable organic layer. High-intensity, high-heat wildfires can also contribute to the loss of serotinous cones and lodgepole pine stands that would normally have a positive impact on regeneration. This can be dramatically disruptive impact to natural recovery. Destruction of forest soils can lead to excessive nutrient debris runoff, leaving depleted and eroded soils for tree regeneration, both natural and artificial. Loss of the forest canopy can also lead to invasive plant populations to explode and effectively choke out healthy tree regeneration. We all know all factors point to more destructive, higher intensity, and more severe wildfires in our future. So where do we go from here? Our state forest action plans that the Undersecretary mentioned are based on the belief of conserving, protecting, and enhancing our nation's forest. The National Cohesive Strategy lays out the tenets of developing resilient ecosystems, creating fire-adapted communities, and a coordinated response to wildfire. I propose that we expand our view of these two great tools, along with good neighbor authority and the shared stewardship philosophy, to include post-fire restoration as a necessary activity to achieve resilient ecosystems, fire-adapted communities, and to assist in our response to wildfire in the future. It's critical that local, state, and federal governments, along with homeowners and other partners, coordinate closely to maximize the effectiveness of post-fire treatments. It's not a cheap or easy path forward. It deals with dollars, both public and private, land management decisions, public policy, and private property rights. But it's a path I believe we must go down if we want to protect lives, homes, and our natural resources for the future.
Thank you, Bill. With that, we'll turn to Jolie.
Hi, I want to thank WGA for inviting BLM to talk on this panel, surrounded by foresters. So, kind of one of the biggest restoration challenges that we face in rangelands is just that what we've heard about. There's a lot of policy and attention on forested systems and less attention on rangeland systems. We talked a lot yesterday. I don't need to go into a lot of details about the invasive and wildfire cycle, especially in those cheatgrass invaded rangelands. But this is kind of our big issue, at least for BLM and for most of the western states, especially in the Great Basin. But cheatgrass is an emerging issue across the West. So if you think you're not impacted now, I think it's coming. So we've done a few statistics, and I just want to point out that in 2017, the last year that I pulled together the data, more than 30% more rangeland acres burned than forest acres burned in the United States. Yet rangeland fires don't get the same attention that forest fires do. Undersecretary Hubbard talked a little bit about some of the new authorities that were received in the when they got the fire funding fix for the wildfire issue. Some new authorities that did not apply to BLM, didn't apply to rangelands. And then there's the Farm Bill that's under consideration right now. There are some wildfire provisions in there, and technically BLM is included as an afterthought, but they're all couched under a topic called forest resiliency. And there's other pending legislation that also is all kind of under the topic of forest resiliency. BLM is sometimes included in there, but we're kind of like added in, penciled in at the end. And when they talk about forest plans in that legislation, they say, oh yeah, and BLM land use plans are also included. But everything still has got a very strong forest fire emphasis and forest fire focus. And in fact, we have when we deal with a lot of wildfires in the landscape during the high tempo fire season in the West, we have convene a bunch of the different land managers, and we have a representative from the National Association of State Foresters on that group. But there's not, I think that most of the folks there are kind of recognizing the importance of fire in rangelands, but still, in the states, forest fires tend to be managed and overseen by a state forester. So that also maybe is a broken link to kind of addressing some of the rangeland fire issues in the West. So for DOI, rangeland fire issues are a really big deal. Less than 23% of acres burned on DOI lands were actually forested. That's about commensurate with the amount of forest land that DOI manages, all the agencies within DOI, BLM, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and BIA. 3 out of every 4 acres of all DOI land burned in the last 18 years was in what we would call rangelands. And most of this is happening in cheatgrass invaded rangelands. And the insidious thing is that cheatgrass, even in really small amounts on the landscape, tends to be a driver of that fire behavior in rangelands. So some studies are saying as soon as you have 10 to 15% cheatgrass on those landscapes, the fire tends to be driven by that fuel type on that landscape. So it's definitely an emerging problem in areas that didn't maybe experience cheatgrass in their landscapes and ecosystems, but this is obviously a really big deal, and definitely what's driving fires on BLM and definitely driving fires for the whole Department of the Interior. Cheatgrass landscapes burn nearly 4 times more frequently than in native vegetation types. So, you know, from an economic standpoint, we have to come back to these landscapes, and some of the, we've been talking about landscapes where we've excluded fire, where we need to return fire to the landscape, and for the most part, in the Great Basin and in a lot of parts of the West, where you've got cheatgrass there, that's really not an option. And in fact, fire is a way more frequent visitor to those landscapes than what had happened historically. So we've got to respond to fires way more frequently in those landscapes. They're burning huge amounts of land, hundreds of thousands of acres at a time in severe fires. So this is a big taxpayer cost in terms of fire suppression, repeated post-fire recovery actions, loss of grazing, loss of wildlife habitat for hunting and fishing, and loss of recreation opportunities on these landscapes. And the other interesting thing is that post-fire costs in these landscapes typically are many times what the actual suppression effort is. Unlike the Forest Service, fires in these landscapes tend to be short-lived, even though they're huge, and don't typically rack up the same cost as some of these fires, these long-duration fires that occur in these higher elevation forests. But we are doing a lot of work in these landscapes, at least BLM and our partners. We talked a lot about it the last few days. We're doing a lot of conifer removal. We're moving juniper. We're using herbicides to minimize the cheatgrass cover. We're seeding perennial grasses and desired species. And we're trying to do some proactive habitat restoration in these landscapes so they are more fire resilient. And the other thing that we're doing a lot are really strategic fuel treatments in these landscapes. So we have trying to develop networks of fuel breaks using existing roads, amplifying the vegetation management along those already disturbed areas, and doing some green stripping. And then when we do this, this also provides an opportunity for enhanced fire response. And this really helps BLM and our cooperators like the Rangeland Fire Protection Associations can get into these areas, and maybe we can have a better potential to stop these really large fires. We can stop them when they're a little bit smaller. It just gives us another more safe and effective line for response. Another thing that we're really looking at are some ways to do some innovative and creative grazing practices on these landscapes. We're seeing how we can modify these fuels and kind of have a win-win with our kind of these working landscapes. So the best line of defense is to prevent a fire from occurring in these areas, because once a fire occurs, we have to invest a lot of resources to restore these landscapes. But of course, once we do get a fire, we get right to work at planning and implementing these post-fire recovery actions. So a lot of the same post-fire recovery actions are the same things that we do to restore resiliency proactively. We do kind of some of the same things reactively. We'll use a combination of seeding, planting, and herbicides. But the issue is the scale at this point. So when you've got 100,000, 400,000, 600,000 acres burned on the landscape, restoring these areas post-fire is really challenging, especially when the environmental conditions are not favorable to these post-fire restoration actions. So really what we're trying to do is prevent fire in a lot of these landscapes. Because we don't have the budget and the tools and the resources to treat all of the acres, all these burned areas. We do employ some tools to help us prioritize and make sure we're investing our resources into the highest priority areas. And so this graphic demonstrates some ecosystem resilience and resistance concepts across the sagebrush range. So the areas in blue are those that tend to be, that are higher elevation, they're more moist, they can have a higher probability of ecologically bouncing back after fire. And the areas in red are those at risk of losing key ecosystem components when faced with fire. So in those areas in the red, we're going to face a lot of restoration challenges. So these are areas that are probably already struggling, even without disturbance, to maintain native plant communities. So restoration challenges in these rangelands become progressively more complex and challenging as we move from these high to low resistance and resilience areas. So this is just one of the tools that we use to help prioritize and focus our efforts on the landscape. And what we really need to point out is that the scale of these efforts really needs to match the scale of the disturbance. You know, we're trying to do some really tie in a lot of fuel breaks, these networks that we know aren't going to be effective 100% of the time. We're trying to come up with some thresholds that maybe during kind of 75 to 85 percentile weather and fuel conditions that they'll be successful. But we've really got to go big, and to go big, that involves working with our neighbors, working with our partners. So this is where we really want to work with other state and local partners as well as other federal partners to focus our prevention of these large fires in the first place, and then restoring these landscapes before and after fire to make them more resilient to wildfire impacting these landscapes. And then the other thing, a couple other things that we can do is also preventing human-caused fires on these landscapes. A lot of these really large fires are happening because of carelessness or negligence and they're human-caused fires. So whatever we can do collectively to prevent human-caused fires allows us to focus more resources on lightning-caused fires. So we have a really high human-caused fire statistics here in the West, and we could all work together to decrease that. And then the last thing that we can do, and through some of our partners, is really raise the profile of rangeland fire policy type issues. I think that would be really helpful as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jolie. Daniel?
Good morning, everybody. As Doug mentioned, my name is Daniel Denapa. I work with the Santa Clara Pueblo Forestry as their Forest Development and Restoration Manager. I'm going to try to get through my slides as quickly as possible. I have quite a few of them, and I could probably sit here like the rest of you all day and explain everything that we're doing out there, but it takes a lot of time. So I'm going to give you a little brief history of Santa Clara Pueblo. Is known as Kapo Awinge, which is the place of the wild roses. There they have, they've been there since time of memorial. Presently today, Santa Clara people have their ancestral village, which is Puye. It's just located a little ways up the valley there, where they used to live, and there's a big site there that, a cultural site that we're really interested in protecting there, and we usually do a lot of treatments in those areas. The culture and traditions have strongly survived over the years and continue to be passed down from generation to generation. The people there are really adamant in keeping their language intact. And that's been a big focal point on their part. Okay, we also known for their pottery making. As you know, Santa Clara has a lot of good potters there. And you can see from an example on the bottom there, they have some beautiful artwork that's produced through that. The people are also dependent on utilizing the land. You know, they still go out, they still collect herbs and stuff and food, medicinal plants. And agricultural, so it's almost their sanctuary up there. They like to consider that, I guess, as nature's grocery store. Okay, just a photo there. That's a photo before the devastation that we've had from those Conchas Fire that actually came off of Forest Service land. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but this is just what it used to look like before that fire. Okay, we have the pre-Los Conchas fires, you can see there, and then you have the post-Los Conchas fire. You can see a lot of those areas were really devastated. and a lot of the timber there was lost. A lot of the soils became hydrophobic, and a lot of the sediment moved down into the canyon there. Just a little bit of history on the Los Conchas fire, which started in 2011. The cause was by a down power line that happened in the Jemez mountain range there, just maybe about, I would say, 30 miles from Santa Clara property. The rate of spread there was 1 acre per second, approximately 400,000 acres in 8 hours. So you can see how fast and quickly that moved through those areas. The total burned area was 156,000 acres. That was both on Forest Service and tribal lands there. And some of it did impact BLM. Some of the areas that burned on Santa Clara land were about 15,500 acres. That was about 50% of our watershed up there. So, you know, it did have a big impact on the canyon. And a lot of that sanctuary that we were talking about, people can no longer go up there and enjoy those areas because it's just a little bit too dangerous. The Santa Clara Creek watershed area is about 31,400 acres. Here's a map just showing the burn intensity. Of course, you know, the darker red is going to be your higher intensity. Some of the orange is going to be moderate, and then you have your yellow, which signifies the lower intensity. But you can see how much of that area was actually consumed in their upper watershed. Kind of going back again, when we were looking right after the fire, you can see that burn scar there. And Santa Clara used to have 4 ponds up there, recreational ponds, which they had a lot of good fishing. You know, a lot of people from the Espanola Valley would actually go up there and were allowed to camp and do other things and get some good fishing. And just before that fire happened, actually, they were just about to implement native trout up there, where they were actually going to start reestablishing native trout waters up there. Unfortunately, the fire happened probably about a day before that was actually going to happen. So that kind of really set a lot of stuff back. Here's just another example of what the fire actually came up along that edge, and then the green part down the middle there. We were fortunate that some of those areas actually weren't impacted by fire, and that's kind of what we call our biological stronghold right now, because we have to utilize some of those areas to naturally revegetate and expand on that. Just another example, there you can actually see one of the ponds on the bottom there, and I'll show more photos as we go along, but you'll see the amount of sediment and everything that came down that actually impacted those ponds on the bottom. And here's actually a part of the flood that was videotaped by Governor Chavarria during the time that one of the floods, actually the bigger floods that came through. And from the time that it was raining up on top of those areas, they measured the time to be around 45 minutes when the water actually reached this point. And down below that was the actual town of Santa Clara, which was about another half an hour to 45 minutes from where that water would have actually impacted the people down below. I'm not sure if it's going to show the video or not.
Look at all the dust.
Look at all those trees, bro.
You can kind of hear the people in the background there. You'll see as that flood starts coming down what we're talking about there.
Almost to the T, bro, an hour.
That's him kind of estimating the time it was taken to get down that hill, like we said, when we had actually measured it, was about 45 minutes from that point.
Go back a little bit.
Damn, this has a lot of debris in it, look.
Yeah.
You gonna back up to that big old bomb?
As you can see, a lot of the debris coming down. You'll see a lot of the logs, a lot of rocks that they said couldn't float. Actually, the size, boulder size is about a small car there that were actually coming down. You can see from the amount of debris there, a lot of the logs and stuff that were actually being washed down. And actually being chased up the road. Again, you can kind of see a lot of the stuff that's being deposited there, a lot of the trees. The amount of sediment that came down with that was actually really incredible. Like, you know, we do have amounts that we pulled out from the ponds that they had there, which were actually completely filled and toppled. And I think that kind of shows most of the video there. A lot of, like I said, the debris that came down with that. There's some photos here where actually the power lines were impacted down below. You can see the cutting that happened along with the erosion that followed that actual incident. This is a part of one of the ponds there that actually had a nice stream and a nice bridge that crossed to that. But again, you know, some of the damage that happened to that infrastructure there, areas, a lot of the cabins that were up there were also lost. Actually, all of them were. And you can kind of see there's one example of one that actually survived, but has a big hole in it from where the water actually pushed through. This is an example of one of the ponds that was nice and a good fishing hole that a lot of people used to enjoy, but actually got cemented over with the amount of sediment that was pushed down. There was actually 27 tributaries that lead down into those areas, so you can imagine with each one of those flowing, the amount of sediment and everything that was actually flowing into these areas. Again, like we were saying, you know, with the hydrophobic soils, a lot of these areas were just like concrete or pavement. You can see from that was actually a road that went through there, but no longer exists. So soon after that, we actually assembled a team to get up there. There was an incident where some heavy equipment folks were actually trapped up in those areas. Just right above where that gentleman's walking right there, I don't know if you can see where that log is, there's actually an excavator that's buried there that was completely covered. And just a few more examples of the cutting. That was right along the road there. The road was severely impacted, and a lot of those areas, you know, we were looking at what would be a good way to address some of those issues, and what was developed was those Conchas Fire team was assembled. And we brought together a lot of the agencies to kind of devise a plan on how we'd get up there and work some of these areas. And the first thing was a short-term kind of a fix that we were looking at, and one was putting in just a temporary road, which still exists now. We're kind of moving a little bit away from that, and I'll discuss that a little bit more as we're moving into recovery and the midterm fixes. Like I had mentioned before, you know, a lot of work had to be done. We had a lot of hazard tree removal. Of course, we had a lot of trees that were impacting the area that were just really hazardous and ready to fall down on people. And in order to kind of take care of that situation, you know, we did a little bit of salvage logging, and we're kind of managed to get some of those logs and utilize them actually for lumber. It's just another example of some of the erosion that was taking place that actually impacted some of those areas that I had talked about as far as the biological stronghold that we wanted to protect. So in order, like I said, to get up in these areas, we had to reestablish the road so people could actually get in there and start working some of these areas and start putting in some structures. There's just a big amount, again, showing a sediment that was deposited from one of the tributaries off of the main stem of the Santa Clara Creek. And just a good example of what was left after the burn there. When we look at that, a lot of the just dead standing poles. Of course, you know, conditions up there weren't exactly the best before the fire. And a lot of trees were suppressed. We had a lot of some bug kill and stuff that issues we were dealing with at the time of the actual fire. And again, just a couple of quick photos showing you some of the areas that were impacted. A lot of the erosion and the cutting, you can actually see how deep those crevices became, and in some areas they were measured up to about 20 feet. Kind of showing you what was actually coming down was some of those trees and a lot of the, again, the sediment. Like I said, that was basically just like cement. Once it settled in there, it was really difficult to get that stuff out. Again, going back to looking at our temporary road, if you look on the, I believe it would be that left-hand side, you can actually see where the road used to be. And then kind of going down again, looking in those areas, that's actually where the road used to be, like I said. We kind of assembled our heavy equipment team, and they managed to get up there and get right to work. And what we started to do, like I said, was starting to reestablish the road. We had to move it over in a couple of places just due to the creek had moved and the amount of sediment that was actually coming down in those areas. And that's what it looks like today. We're actually managed to put in a good road. We're looking at now, you know, our midterm establishing some of those areas again that we can work and getting some of that restoration done. So we had actually put in some debris fences, and this is an example of one of them, and I'll show a couple more slides. This is actually where we put our T-Rex up there and kind of keeps him at bay, but these are the debris fences that actually kind of hold and catch some of that debris and stop the impacts from our road. Should we get another flood event, you know, we put those in place so that way we'd be able, again, like I said, to maintain our road. Just another example of that, looking at some of the debris flow structures that we had put in, probably just from a different angle there. We also put some gabion structures to complement those debris fences up and down. They didn't want to exactly put those in the pond areas because they're not permanent structures. They're there just as a temporary relief to kind of slow down and disperse the water from impacting the village down below. A lot of these examples, we had went out to areas just adjacent to us, which is Los Alamos, and kind of look at their structures and what they had in place, and that's kind of where we came up with a concept and design of what we actually wanted to put out there. And there's just a couple of examples of what we're looking at. We didn't want to put anything as elaborate because everything is just temporary, and we're going to eventually just cover those up. A lot of what was impacted was, the springs and the wetlands. And as we put together our plans with the Los Conchas team, we actually took a systematic approach to things. And again, we wanted to start from the top and work our way down. As you know, erosion kind of works its way up, and we wanted to kind of meet it head on, and try to put some of those structures so we can get the sediment to rebuild and reconnect some of those areas where we found that the water was just rushing down really fast, and it wasn't being very effective, and it was actually impacting the village down below more than anything. So we managed to try to alleviate some of that by putting in some structures, and we'll take a better look at that here in a few. Cattle's been a big problem up there. There's a cattlemen's association in Santa Clara there, and those areas I was talking about, there's not a whole lot of it. Of course, the cattle tend to flock to those areas because that's the only green spots that they have, and that's basically where all their food and water is coming from. So, we're taking measures now where we actually fenced off some of those wetlands so we can get them to regenerate and eventually let that cattle come back in and work with it. We also did a lot of contour tree felling for erosion control on some of those steeper slopes, where we could kind of slow down some of that sediment and a lot of stuff that was being pushed off of those areas. We did in-channel stream restoration treatments where we, again, we put some log mattresses, zuni bowls, and just kind of structures there to kind of take care of that. There's just a couple more examples of felling and log structures that we have. You can kind of see there the disconnect of what was actually going on. Our reforestation, we've been have a 10-year plan actually where we managed to plant about 800,000 trees in the past 5 years. It's kind of toning down a little bit. Of course, our funding is not what it used to be, so we're having to kind of pull back on how much trees and stuff that we can actually plant. And we're looking at different things such as nucleation planting, where we're just going to put small pockets of trees and stuff and see if we can expand off of that. And there's just some of the collaborators that we have. Like I said, we couldn't do it on our own. We had to reach out to a lot of different agencies in order to get this accomplished, but it was definitely a lot of work and trying to get this done. And fortunately, things are starting to look up a little bit, and hopefully we can actually get some of the people up there to see what our work is. But again, thank you for having us here, and you guys have a wonderful afternoon.
Well, thank you, Daniel. That was a sobering illustration of challenges associated with restoration, and that's what I'd like to start my first question being about some challenges with restoration, and I'd like to start with you, Jim, and then we can go down the table for other insights that we have. I know there's a lot of them. But you know, obviously we have landslides and water quality concerns immediately following fire. Do you have plans to change or improve the way that you coordinate action plans and work through regulatory hurdles to get boots on the ground quickly, efficiently, effectively? What are some of the barriers that you face with restoration and its timely implementation?
Well, despite what you just saw, that kind of work and that follows that kind of devastation is just not on decision makers' radar screens. Getting Congress to pay attention to post-fire is not going to happen anytime soon, I would predict. They're too concerned about the active fire and all that it takes. So I haven't had much luck convincing anybody that this is important and needs more work. I believe if we take the approach that I was describing in sharing our investment priorities, that some of the states might think differently, and that might shift how some of the Forest Service spends its money. And Congress is looking at a different way of appropriating the money. We have a lot of line items in the Forest Service right now. They want fewer. And they want fewer to give the agency more flexibility to be more responsive to issues like this. That might come about beginning in 2020. But the issue by itself it just doesn't rise to the same urgency as an active fire.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from the panel?
I'd agree with where Jim is as far as where decision makers look at it. I think where we're seeing some success both in pre-fire and post-fire restoration is, and especially like this last slideshow should wake some folks up, is with public utilities. We've had pretty good success with the Board of Public Utilities here in Cheyenne, working with the Medicine Bow National Forest on some good neighbor projects pre-fire to help stop things like that happening. And I think it looks to me where we're starting to get traction is with the folks who depend on those watersheds, the downstream people.
And I'll just add for the BLM and the Department of the Interior, our restoration funding comes through a departmental allocation, and then so the bureaus need to kind of work out some allocation processes among ourselves, and there's always challenges and complexities associated with making sure that the right agencies are getting the right funding to get the work done on the ground at the right time when those funds are needed. And then in the rangelands, I think I pointed out that one of our challenges is really to protect this restoration investment. We're getting fires a lot more frequently, and so we don't want those investments to go up in smoke when another wildfire comes and potentially impacts that area. So we're trying to figure out some tools to help us with that.
And I would assume, Daniel, that this little incident woke some people up and maybe did change your action plan a little bit. Can you speak to that?
Definitely did. You know, as we look at, you know, the biggest driver there is going to be the funding portion of it. You know, constantly looking for that funding, bringing money in so we can keep efforts going on a long-term basis. You know, and it's not just with restoration, but it's also with invasive species and a lot of thinning and stuff like that, being proactive in trying to manage some of those areas so if we do have a fire again, that we'd be able to at least address those issues that come along with it.
And obviously wildfire impacts well, anywhere, but we're talking about the West here. It can cover hundreds of thousands of acres, and even your most effective restoration plans can only treat a very small percentage of those that are impacted. How do your respective agencies prioritize restoration efforts when facing impacts on such a large scale? And I know, Jolie, you talked about, or you showed a ecosystem resistance and resilience map. And, you know, when you're talking about prevention, are you better suited to put your resources to those areas that are most susceptible, or somewhere on that gradient? Where's your best bang for the buck?
Yeah, and that's the $1 million question, literally, or multi-million-dollar question. So, you know, we do employ some tools to help us make those decisions and identify those priorities. And there's a lot of factors that we consider. One is kind of the potential success of the restoration, perhaps the other values that might be impacted. So we are trying to employ some tools and trying to figure out prioritizing the limited funds that we have and where we have the most success, and then identifying the areas that if we were impacted by fire, would be really complex and challenging to restore, and trying to protect those areas that are kind of on those margins right now that currently do have native components and are functioning to provide wildlife habitat and other values on the landscape, and where if fire did impact those areas because of the elevation and precip zone, that restoration success would maybe be really challenging or unlikely. So we're trying to protect those areas too. So it's kind of an all the above approach.
Any other thoughts on prioritization from the panel?
Yes, this is one, at least in the rangelands and in the critical habitat for sage grouse, BLM owns most of that issue. But Forest Service owns some of it, and we certainly want to be in sync with our prioritization and protecting those critical habitat areas that we don't want converted. We don't want any of it converted to cheatgrass, but it's going to happen in places, and there's some places we pay more attention, and very consistent with the BLM's analysis of where we make those investments.
Right now, Santa Clara, we're working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs to actually map out some areas that we can identify as problem areas. That way, if we do have another, let's say, fire incident on our land, the team would be able to utilize that information and how we want to actually attack that fire and put it out or utilize it, fire utilization in some of those areas.
Doug, from a state's perspective, we use our forest action plan to identify areas, not just in forest, but on rangelands in the state too, that are of high fire potential, are important priority resources for the suppression side or the pre-fire management. Unfortunately, from the post-fire recovery area, like most states, we have a budget of $0 for fire restoration. We work with weed and pest. We have in your department. We work with our federal partners to try to do what we can, but we really don't have a good post-fire plan in the state.
My next question has to do with statutes and regulations. I already have a strong opinion on this one, but I would like to get some insight from your perspectives. Do the current suite of statutes and regulations allow for timely and effective restoration? If not, what would need to change? I hate to crack open that NEPA box again, but I'll do it anyway.
No, we don't, and a lot needs to change.
Thank you.
I think that's pretty much in a nutshell, you know, for all of us up here. I don't think there's really any quick way to get around the NEPA process. and things that need to be done other than, you know, just staying consistent and trying to stick with your plans and getting things done.
Yeah, and I'd echo all of that, except also add that we also need to make sure that our regulations and policies are addressing the full suite of the fire problem on the landscape, and words matter. And when we, you know, and we really need to focus this fire issue to be inclusive of all the different vegetation types across the West, for sure.
Forest Service is making some concerted efforts on NEPA reform, and even within existing statute,
Right.
and that to convert some of the timelines from years to months, and having some success at that.
I think, Doug, one thing that we're seeing, I believe, across the West is we used to have Forest Service fire or BLM fire or private land fire or tribal fire. That doesn't happen anymore. With the size fires we're having, the severity of fires, almost any fire we're going to have is multi-jurisdictional. So when we start looking at challenges of the rules, regulations, statutes, we're dealing with tribal land, with Department of Interior land, with Forest Service land, with private and state lands, and trying to meld those together. Like I said earlier, we've done fairly good in our response to fire. We haven't done so good in our response after fire.
Okay. I think with this panel, it would be probably more productive to leave it just a little bit more time for the attendees of the session here to interact and have some dialogue with the panel. So I'm going to cut off my questions here and open it up to the floor for anybody that might have some questions or ideas and further expand on some of these challenges.
John Swartout, Colorado Governor's Office. This question is for Jim. First of all, the Forest Service in Colorado did an excellent job on the fire season that we had. They worked well. They worked well with the state. They worked well with the local governments. They have nothing but praise for how they handled themselves in Colorado this summer. I guess my question is, and I dealt with this yesterday on restoration funding, ERP funding specifically, a lot of places where these fires occur, the local governments are disadvantaged from a financial standpoint. They're poorer counties where the bulk of these Forest Service lands are. So to make the match is difficult, and it was working with the Colorado Water Conservation Board and with our Department of Local Affairs to come up with the money for the match. But what I was hearing from our agencies is it's so difficult to work, you know, through the contracting process right now with NRCS, not because of a lack of effort on NRCS's part. We have a good relationship with them, but just because of the sheer amount of rules and regulations that our folks are willing to provide the match from the state level, because damage to water infrastructure is very much in our interest to get that work done. And we're happy to provide that local government match, but our people don't, at the state level, don't want to be the contractors. So the point I'd like to make is the effort to improve the customer service is one thing that we can do and we should do, because it would make it a lot easier in the aftermath of these fires. So I think the direction that the Secretary is taking to improve customer service, but this is one specific area. Our folks are willing to provide the money, but they don't want to stand up and be the sponsor and in charge of the contracts and in charge of that relationship. So your efforts to improve that are right on target.
Thanks, John.
Other comments, questions?
Yeah, this is, I hope I'm not, anyway. I kind of a question for the in the entire panel. It would be, you know, it seems like a lot of this comes back to some sort of relevancy, and with our funding to get this restoration done. And it struck me as we watched that video, the amount of water and the water holding capacity that we're losing post-fire when the restoration work isn't done. And even though maybe to the urban folks below that, I think Albuquerque's down the valley from you, maybe they're not so interested in what happened in the watershed, but they probably are very interested in getting a drink or taking a shower, and that water holding capacity. Do you think that we could couch or make the case that one of the values that we're losing here is water holding capacity coming off of both forest lands and rangelands through this process? And so that's a question. I just want to see if I'm way out there.
Not at all. The water providers pay a lot of attention to this these days because we're having more large fires that do that kind of damage and produce those kinds of results. A few years ago, more than a few years ago, what we saw in those slides reminded me of the Buffalo Creek fire west of Denver. And it produced that kind of result and filled Strontia Springs Reservoir, which was the primary collection treatment reservoir for the city of Denver. And they served brown water to their customers for 2 days. So the argument that you can treat all of that out was gone. And the realization that that watershed is critical to a whole lot of the water providers was realized. But then it became a matter of what can you do about it, and how do you incorporate that into your system, and do you pass on fees to your customers to treat watersheds? And those are more difficult decisions and take a little longer. From Buffalo Creek to the time Denver actually implemented fees to the customers to treat watersheds at scale was 11 years. So it takes a while, but they're getting it more and more, and they're certainly paying attention. And with the condition of our western forest, we'll have the reminders every year.
I agree. I think water is the key to making this issue the prominence it should have. I think a lot of the utilities are becoming more interested. The problem is, as we all know, the public likes to turn their tap on and water comes out of it, and with a few glaring examples otherwise, all of us within the system have probably done too good a job of making sure that isn't disrupted. And I think that's, when you look at natural resource management overall, water should be our big focus. That's the crux of everything that we do. However, it's taken for granted way too often.
Just to touch on what you had mentioned about the people downstream from the Rio Grande, the Santa Clara Creek actually does feed into the Rio Grande. And interesting that you had mentioned that, because Santa Fe actually has a pump down there, and it was actually impacted by the amount of sediment that was going down, and actually caused that system to break down. A lot of that was also deposited downstream into the Cochiti Reservoir, which also impacts Albuquerque. So it's interesting that you did say that. There was a lot of people that were impacted by the result of that. And like you said, you know, the biggest driver is the funding, and looking at the money it takes to try to get that done. Again, you know, looking at with a healthy watershed, you know, leads to a healthy forest, in turn leads to a healthy community.
So my name is Curtis Elke. I'm the state conservationist for Idaho NRCS. And we as state conservationists, we've set aside funding for these kind of situations. And in fact, we just have requested additional funding for a lot of the wildfires that have occurred this year. But what that does is it takes away other project opportunities that we could be spending this money on that we request. So my question is to, as we seek funding certainty, what is FEMA's role in our natural disasters of the West and wildfires specific?
FEMA's role in wildfires specifically is you can request, a state can request a fire management assistance grant, or we call them FMAG grants, because we like acronyms better than, like everybody else, we like acronyms better. These grants are specifically to assist the state and the local government in fire suppression. They're not recovery grants. They're not disaster grants from that standpoint. They're for fire suppression. FEMA started a program a couple years ago as a pilot. It is a program now for an add-on mitigation portion of those grants that are post-fire recovery. They have some, like all programs that we all manage, they have some interesting challenges, interesting procedures that you have to follow to do the money, to get the money, and they're for overall hazard mitigation in the county that the fire was in. It's not a huge amount of money. We had a FMAG fire in the western part of the state here recently, and the mitigation dollars that will be available are, I think, $411,000, and it's just a set amount. It doesn't matter whether the FMAG fire was 1,000 acres or 100,000 acres. It's the same amount of dollars. There's 75-25% grants. They're usually managed. FMAG is a relationship with FEMA is a strange duck. From the fire suppression part of it, it's usually managed by the state forester or state wildland fire agency. The hazard mitigation part of it that comes at the end is usually managed by the emergency management or Homeland Security office in the state. So there has to be a strong partnership between those agencies to make it work. But there are some dollars available, but they're not disaster dollars like we're going to see FEMA put into Hurricane Michael. They're a different, out of a different pot of FEMA money, totally different program.
Other questions? A couple more.
I'm Dallin Smith with USU Extension in Rich County. I just have a question on the beetle kill part. Is there any incentives in place right now for loggers and other people to utilize that beetle kill wood, and is that a possibility?
No federal incentives that I'm aware of. Maybe Bill knows, but and is that a possibility? Not currently, but if we move to a different system, sharing our priorities with the states and having a different appropriation mechanism, possibly.
I think right now, I think the biggest issue with bark beetle killed timber as far as utilization across the West is infrastructure, industry infrastructure, and the reduction of infrastructure. We're also seeing a lot of bark beetle impacts that are really impacting fire in areas that aren't merchantable timber, never were merchantable timber. We do have a state program to help counties, either the weed and pest or the county conservation districts, to deal with bark beetle issues in their district. Unfortunately, that money is tied to our emergency fire suppression account, which I drained this summer in fire suppression, so the money's not available to do bark beetle. I think a lot of it with beetle killed timber, as we look at utilization, there's also the marketability of beetle kill, even if a mill runs it. In a previous life, I worked for Louisiana Pacific, and we're stud mills. We're making 2x4s and 2x6s that go inside the walls. And our main customer was Home Depot, and Home Depot's view was they didn't want any blue-stained 2x4s because they thought they were ugly and didn't want them in their stores. We worked with them a lot on that. The acceptance of that material has improved over the years, but I think it's a myriad of things. But I don't believe there's any incentives to incentivize somebody to cut it. The biggest incentive, I think, either on Forest Service, BLM, or state and private timber is it's usually salvage timber, and it usually goes for a lot lower stumpage value than green timber would.
Well, thank you, panel. Please help me thank the panel, especially those of these guys that came so far. With that, we have a break scheduled, and we'll reconvene at 10:45.